Hi, this is Cameron Chell, and I am the chairman. Luckily, I get to be the chairman of ICOX, and one of our very esteemed board members is the Honorable Edmund Moy, who is the 38th director of the U.S. Mint. And Ed.
And no free samples because you gave a great introduction.
Darn. Aside from the unbelievable experience that you bring to the board and how you contribute and such, a question I often get when people ask about you is, what's Ed thinking? Like, not why you necessarily joined the board, but what's Ed thinking about crypto? And what is the former head of the U.S. Mint? What's his real perspective on cryptocurrencies and what they mean for the potential future of fiat?
That's a multifaceted question. So let me start off by how I first got engaged, which was I served as Mint director from 2006 to 2011. So when the white paper came out toward the end of my tenure, my planning staff started following what was happening with Bitcoin as a precursor of what could happen in the future. What was really intriguing about that to me was up until this time, electronic money is fairly common, right? Credit cards, electronic funds transfers, et cetera, but they all go over proprietary financial highways. And what Bitcoin's potential was, it goes over the internet. And that changes everything. That's the difference between the US Post Office delivering mail and using Gmail. It could really revolutionize how value is transferred from one individual to another. I also like it in that even though I was a maker of fiat currency, and I don't think many people can claim that, I'm intrigued about cryptocurrency because it is decentralized, and as a result, there's no central governing body behind it, and I view this as a free market alternative to government's monopoly on money. And by having it out there, will eventually make fiat currency better, and in the best case, provide a viable alternative for people to use on a regular basis. And that's just talking about Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies to be used as a currency. That doesn't even begin to touch on the technology that drives it, like the cryptography, like hashing, or the blockchain.
So often, it's fascinating you bring it up and talk about fiat being better. Because so often when we get into these conversations, or we hear these conversations or read about these conversations, it tends to be at either or. It's either decentralized or it's government controlled, and it's fiat against crypto. What I heard you say was a very different perspective than what's typically out there right now. And so in light of that, what do you see as the potential future of fiat as it relates to crypto?
Yep. So I see governments right now beginning to explore. Bank of England is one of them. The Royal Bank of Canada had also begun doing some research on how crypto could benefit fiat currency. And to an extent, there are some things that fiat currency can co-opt. The cryptography for instance. Can you imagine once you get the hash out and you can track where and how fiat currency is being used, we'll actually have an accurate indicator of the velocity of currency. And right now they only do sampling, and it's really bad sampling to begin with, but it's the best we can do given the existing technology. Using elements of crypto will advance that, and we'll have a much better understanding of monetary policy on the impact of an economy.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, but there are also limitations. I mean, one reason why Bitcoin was so innovative is they limited Bitcoin to 21 million being produced. With fiat currency, virtually unlimited amounts are being produced, and it's very unlikely that a sovereign government would ever want to limit their ability to expand or contract the currency for their own reasons, political or economic.
Now that you are one of the few people who have been deep in both spaces, and we tend to always hear this question, what does fiat need to learn from crypto? Really, what do we in crypto need to learn from fiat? What are we missing as a community and as a society, if you will, in terms of what crypto needs to bring to the world? What is your experience telling us that we need to do different or better?
Yeah, it's a great question, Cam, because I see a huge disconnect between the what crypto can offer and what people understand crypto to be. And just one real simple way is how to use it. What's the utility behind crypto? And when you ask the typical person who's into crypto to explain it, they go into the asymmetric keys, the blockchain, and I'll tell you, my mom, when she was alive, her eyes kind of glazed over, and she just didn't get it. And so fiat currency is known because it's the standard, and I think while the technology is fascinating, the people who advocate for crypto need to bring it to a really plain and simple level. And then second, there needs to be utility. And that's one thing when you see the birth of these ICOs and the development of digital economies. I think that's where most people are going to get their first experience versus using something like Bitcoin to buy a pizza. So even when you were talking before about When Digital and the Kodak coin, people now will see, or at least experience Kodak coin almost like a frequent flyer mile, or for someone like me who goes way back, an S&H green stamp that could be used for several different purposes. And the whole issue of Kodak coin is no one's explaining it as digital currency, but it's a coin that's used to be paying the photographer for their digital property. People get that. And so the less technical and the more utility, those are some things that I think digital currency world can learn from the fiat world.
I think, one thing that you just said there that just absolutely just floored me was that, and I completely agree with, and I hadn't thought of, I'm gonna use it, but I had not thought of until this moment, is that
you should have to pay me in Kodak coin.
No problem, I'd be happy.
That'll be my royalty.
Is that most people's first experience with crypto isn't going to be with Bitcoin. Mm-hmm. It's going to be with an altcoin.
Yes.
Right? It's going to be,
totally agree
whether
with
it's through the supply chain or whether it's through a frequent flyer coin or some sort, but that is a fascinating aspect. And so when we think about how regulators are approaching altcoins today, is there, do you feel that our securities regulations are going to continue to be the direction that these altcoins are going to have to go through, or are they just going to shake things up so much that the securities regulations just don't count anymore?
Yes. So there was a really interesting question when Janet Yellen had her hearing right after the Mt. Gox fiasco, and a number of members of the committee grilled her, saying, "What are you going to do to protect Americans against being taken? If they invest in Bitcoin or use Bitcoin and it gets stolen, how are you going to make them whole?" And she said, "Well, Congress, you know better than I do. Right now, until you give me legislation authorizing me to regulate it in that fashion, I can't do anything about it." What she was really saying is absence, so all regulation comes from law, and the law usually comes from some catastrophic event of which the public gets hurt. And as a result, Congress, representing the people, want to protect people, so they define that whatever action took place, and then they figure out where the best place to regulate it is or create a new agency around it. In the case of cryptocurrencies, there is no regulation or no law that defines what a cryptocurrency is and what its aspects are. And that's what Janet Yellen was saying is, I don't have any authority to regulate this as a cryptocurrency. In the absence of that, you have all these federal agencies that have already been authorized by law to regulate something. In the absence of a law defining cryptocurrencies, then it is up to each individual agency to see what aspect of cryptocurrency comes into their jurisdiction. So the SEC is looking at cryptocurrency as a security that can be exchanged. The FTC looks at it differently. The IRS looks at it as a taxable event. And so what end up going to happen without legislation is a hodgepodge of regulation. And in order to combat that, the better way of saying, in order to regulate this in a way to preserve the potential of cryptocurrency requires really wise regulation. And so I see the future of this coming from two ways. One is you're going to get greater interest in government in figuring out how to regulate it, and eventually they will pass a law and authorizing an agency and defining and then all the other compliance and consequences. They're going to do that. On the other side, you have basically a decentralized industry. That's the wild, wild west right now. And as a free market conservative, I believe having a total free market is the best for the consumer, but then how do you make sure that there are no bad players in there? And that is, the best way to do that is to have companies self-regulate to a really high standard. And so here's the twofold approach. Government's getting more interested in regulating, and the industry needs to step up with companies that can provide a roadmap for the regulators on how best to regulate the industry without killing innovation.
And I know, Ed, one of the key criteria for you in terms of joining ICOX was helping set a standard, or being a beacon, if you will, in that self-regulatory environment. And are there any hallmarks that you would that you intend to make sure to hold us to in terms of that self-regulatory environment?
That's a really good point, Cam. I mean, one of the big attractions for me to get into this space was using my reputation, my knowledge of how government works, to help shape the industry so that it can thrive. And so I was really looking to participate with companies that I believe provided one right way of how to self-regulate. And so I'm really glad that we've connected on ICOX. We knew each other prior to that. So I knew you, but when I saw what you were doing here, there's a couple things that really intrigued me that differentiate us from a lot of the other people who are kind of pursuing this. Number one is we're going to be a public company. So we've applied to be dual listed in Canada as well as in the United States. We've been granted a provisional conditional approval to be listed in Canada. And what that ends up doing is we have a public company that is regulated with a very, and the government knows how to do that.
Yeah.
And the business that we're in is developing digital economies, which the government's unfamiliar with, but they have the tool to understand that through the public regulation process. And then second, we do business with established brands like Kodak. So in this joint venture with Kodak has to figure out how to do this because they're also a publicly held company. So the regulators really have two bites at the apple to try to figure this out. And I'm not saying this is the only way to self-regulate, but I believe it is a really good way to self-regulate. And this can provide a model for the regulators on how to approach this industry.
Amazing. Ed, thanks so much for all that you're doing for this industry and all of us that are really trying to just kind of create something incredible.
Yeah.
And we're really glad to have you lead us
Well,
through
so
this.
am I. I mean, there's so much potential here, and I don't want to see that potential inhibited by bad companies. And so the more I can help to create good companies, especially the things that we're doing, like with Kodak, protecting intellectual property in the digital age, I mean, that is a huge societal problem, and it's a practical way that the blockchain is perfect for solving that real world problem in a way that benefits society. And so those are the types of things that really get me up in the morning, and I'm so glad that I have a company like ICOX that I can be part of.
Amazing. Thanks, buddy.
All right.
Thanks, Ed.
Great.